Hello, Camille. Welcome. Thanks so much for talking today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So, could you maybe start out by talking a little bit about how you got involved in bisexual advocacy and some of the things you've done in this capacity?
Sure. I actually got started kind of by accident. In my towards the freshman end of my freshman year of college, some friends asked me if I would come moderate a sexuality discussion that they wanted to host for the whole campus. And I to this day I have no idea why they decided I was a good idea. Um, but we had a great time. We had about 30 people. I was at a small private college in Wisconsin, and that turned into a group that lasted longer than I was there for sort of generally just peer support for LGBTQ folks, both at the college and then also in that we had some people from the city that we were in as well. And I changed colleges then. I went to the University of Iowa, connected with their kind of broad LGBTQ group. But after I'd been there about a semester, some folks wanted to start a specific bi discussion circle, and I was there both times that tried to get going because sometimes these things have to try twice or three times before they really catch. And then I was linked into things, and I just kept doing that. I took a break for a little while, and to set
Can
this in
can you
context,
give us a set? Yeah, I was
this is
wondering
all the
about the
early
context in
90s.
terms of timing. Okay, so that was early
Yes,
90s.
this
Great.
is all the early 90s. So yeah, no internet, um, and I mean email and kind of university accounts, but everything was very much in person, and there was no online organizing. That was just not a thing. It was all word of mouth, and so we had a nice discussion circle that went for a while. I took a break. I ended up relocating to the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and in 2008, I went to the kind of reboot of the Because conference, which is sponsored by the Bisexual Organizing Project, based in Minneapolis. And I presented at that conference, ran into a whole bunch of people that I had met in the early 90s when there was a big conference at the University of Iowa, and reconnected into that community. And from then on, I was either presenting or running the conference or running the organization. And I just finished up kind of my last obligations here because 2021 was the last one that I'll run. It has been handed off. So I identify like first and foremost as a community organizer, someone that brings people together in community and creates those kinds of community support spaces. But now I've ended up in Visibility Impact Fund doing work with the money. So
That's great. And I definitely want to hear more about that. But first, I just want to thank you for doing this work. You've been doing it for a long time, and I've attended the Because conference, and it's really a remarkable gathering. And so I just have such gratitude for everything that you have put into this community that has made such a difference and touched so many people.
thank you. I think it starts. For me, it started. I was showing up because I needed that support, and then I stayed around because I felt like I wanted to kind of pay back what I'd gotten from people who had gone ahead of me. And then I found out that I had a huge passion for teaching and presenting and running things, and that I just kind of, you know, kept with it. So I think it's important to find your passion, what part really feeds you, because then you'll keep showing up to do it.
Absolutely. Oh, that's perfect. That's perfect. So tell us a little bit about the Visibility Impact Fund. What is this program? What's it trying to accomplish, and how and what's your role in it?
Sure. So the Visibility Impact Fund started in 2020. So we're about a year and a half into it. It's a giving circle, which means it's structured that people commit to a monthly donation. And for us, we have a very low minimum. So $5 a month, and you're a voting member. We also accept one-time donations, but the goal is to build a community around the monthly donations. And then twice a year, we grant money and the members have the final vote on who is funded. So there's giving circles of a lot of different models, and what was interesting to me was I first heard about giving circles in 2016 when they kind of hit the news, and they were a lot of rich people getting together and putting their money together and funding things, and it was all sort of unsavory for me. So it was kind of neat to learn that they had really moved forward and really become a way to do community and grassroots support for different work. And now now there's quite a community of giving circles. There's organizations you can join that teach you how to do them better and all this kind of stuff. So um, we wanted something that was really interactive for people, and where people felt like they had a say, because a lot of what goes on with the bi community is that either things are done on behalf of us or they're not done at all. So, making sure that our donors have that agency to really have some input on the final funding was important to us. So
That
obviously,
is that's a really exciting structure, and I love the thoughtfulness behind it in terms of engaging people not just as recipients of funds, but as donors, even on a small level. That's a wonderful way for people to invest in something like this, both in terms of their ideas and in terms of funds.
oh, absolutely. But we have two directions that we work. So obviously, we are doing fundraising, we're soliciting grant proposals, and then we have a process that we go through to evaluate those and then present a smaller list to our members for them to vote on. On the other side, though, being a giving circle puts us at the table with other people who fund LGBTQ work. And specifically, we've joined the organization LGBTQ Funders, which exists as an organization of funders who focus or do significant work in LGBTQ nonprofit work. So it's everything from smaller funders. We might be the smallest one at the table right now. I mean, we're only a year and a half old. Up to like the Bush Foundation. I mean, there's giant foundations at that table, and then the mid-sized ones. So really big ones where it's an element of what they do, kind of mid-sized foundations and other philanthropical organizations that fund work sort of in the mid-range, and then smaller funders. And we really wanted to get in there because part of the lack of funding for the bi, pan, fluid, queer community, which I generally refer to as the bi plus community, to kind of acknowledge that we use a lot of labels, but we all have more in common than we don't. So uh, the lack of grants that are specifically for bi work or to support bi people means that there's been an ongoing funding of more general work, but we know that the bi plus community doesn't show up in large numbers to LGBTQ. Like, we're not certain what we're welcome. And so when they fund general programs, it doesn't impact our community enough. So we want to educate other funders about the importance of targeting specific bi plus work, whether that's programs inside larger organizations or supporting bi plus organizations themselves, of which I think we're up to 8 or 9 501c3s in the United States. There's been a huge explosion. So 10 years ago, there were 3 of us that were 501c3s, and everybody else were informal organizations, most of whom didn't have bank accounts even. Like, they did what they did on a shoestring or, love and labor and begging. So we want to change that. And part of that is educating the people who give the money, because the big funding, the funding that keeps large staffed nonprofits going, that's its own industry. Right? It has its own language, it has its own professionals, and we need to educate them about the needs of the community and help them start supporting us. So I'm
That
really excited to be at that table.
I know, and that's fascinating how all of that infrastructure works and how important it is to have a seat at that table because it's a really powerful table. Funders are a very powerful group of people, and being able to make those inroads. This is just my observation, and I'm curious about what you think about it. It seems like over the last few years, people have started to recognize the need to have trans-specific programming and efforts that are specifically for the trans community and not just LGBTQ generally. And it seems like bi-specific programming and funding is lagging even behind that some. Does that sound accurate to you?
Yes, it absolutely does. When I first started doing activism, like the bi community had maybe half a step closer to being included. Because so in the early 90s, all organizations were lesbian and gay organizations, right? They didn't include the word bi, bisexual, trans, nothing. It just wasn't even in the name. The fight in the mid 90s was just to get included in the name. Um, by the early 2000s, you're starting to see the trans community start to get some traction with individuals, and there were some really key pieces to them. And I say them, I am a cisgendered ally, so like I feel a lot of kinship as part of a community that breaks down binaries. But so I watched the trans community really be able to coalesce around a few key moments. And one of the huge ones was when they started a 501c4 that was based in DC. And so they had a constant professional presence in Washington, DC, and they started to shape the language and the impact that they had, particularly during the Obama administration. And they really understood what it was to access the level below the elected officials, right? So they were having really strong impacts there. And they were able to, so you have different things happening in different places, but they got some really good kind of pieces in place that then it became part of the constant conversation in LGBTQ spaces. Matter of fact, at the last LGBTQ funders conference, it was very small compared to what they usually do because it was online. So they were trying to keep it modest. Almost every presentation or workshop was related to the trans community.
Mm-hmm.
It was a discussion of gender inclusivity, and it's just amazing. Like, and I think it's fantastic, particularly because of how we've seen conservative funding pivot. Once they lost the marriage argument, they pivoted straight to anti-trans legislation. They didn't even take a breath, and so it's amazing, like what they've been able to accomplish and how steadfast they have been in that. We are absolutely not in that place.
Yeah.
The bi community, I have all sorts of theories on that, but just from having lived a lot of that history. But that's not the direction that the bi community organizing went, to take the political route, to have funded 501c3s that were working in the political sphere, that were advocating on the corporate level for inclusion.
Right.
So yeah,
You
there's a
and I could
lot.
have, I can see you and I could have a long talk about this because I mean, it is really interesting in terms of there's also not as much anti-bi policy, as there is anti-trans policy. So that makes sense that there's a policy initiative there. But getting back to the funding piece. So tell me a little bit about the kinds of funding that the Visibility Impact project wants to what kinds of projects do you want to support?
So we have a really broad call for applications when we put it out. A lot of funding, like grant application requests and that kind of thing, will be fairly narrow from different places. We wanted ours to be extremely broad because we know there's nothing else out there. So right now we can only fund, federally recognized nonprofits, 501c3s. We are working to finish our back office paperwork to be able to fund other types of organizations and individual projects because so much of the work of our community happens outside of the normal nonprofit structures. And we want to support that. that being said, what we look for are projects that are specifically aimed at meeting the needs of the BI plus community. And we know a lot about BI plus needs. We've had really good data since about 2008, 2009. Like data changed the conversations we were having radically, right? We finally had data where we could go, no, we know things about our community specifically as as opposed to the data. It was always combined. At least LGB was squished together. And as soon as we were able to start pulling that data apart and showing that there needed to continue to be a need for that, we started having much more constructive conversations around what our community needed.
As
So,
a researcher, this warms my heart that data really has
oh
an
my God.
impact. Mhm.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the stories didn't necessarily change, but people believed us. Like our community always knew these things. We knew, but we could only tell um, qualitative stories. And they could always be written off as like, well, that's your experience, or that's the experience of this kind of person in this place. Finally, we got data to be like, no, not only like nobody in the LGBTQ community is doing well, right? Like mental health, physical health, job security, all that sort of thing. But we were able to show that the bi community was often doing measurably, not just within some percentage of error, but like measurably differently from lesbian and gay people who were otherwise the same. So class, race, education, all that sort of thing. And I used to teach about this quite a bit, and I used a general population survey of many Minnesota students because that's a survey that's done every year, and we had an organization that pulled the data apart for us, and we could look at it and go, look, mental health, mental health experiences, treatment, outcomes, like nobody's doing well, nobody is, and what's being done is not impacting the bi community as much. So we're seeing bi identified young people were more likely to be depressed, more likely to be in treatment, more likely to commit suicide. The numbers were chilling. And and that plays out throughout the age range, right? We see a lot of domestic and intimate partner violence. Um, some of the stuff that really surprised me was when I dug into the workplace statistics. Bi people are less likely to be out in the workplace, and so they stay where they tend to move around more. Um, if they're out, one of our stereotypes is that we're kind of wishy-washy and we can't make up our mind and we can't commit. Well, guess what? When your supervisor kind of has that in the back of their brain, they don't give you the big project that lets you launch your career. Because why? I mean, they're not consciously thinking about this, but in their back of their head, they have those things linked. And so even being out as a bi person at work can damage your ability. We know that bi people tend to make less money than our lesbian, gay, or straight peers. And so there's all of these things that play out really subtly throughout our lives that just make the community under resourced. Time, energy, spoons. I mean, when you have when you have a community that experiences mental, physical health trauma, um, there's large parts of our community that their energy all needs to go to keeping themselves functioning, working in this world, all that. And I used to tell people when I was teaching, I'd teach about all these terrible things, and I'd say, I am lightly touched by these things, and that's why I can stand in front of you and talk. And I'm like, you have to understand that huge parts of our community are not in any condition to be doing activism, to be doing advocacy or teaching. Like, it's all they can do to make enough money to get through the day, to find the mental health support they need. And so sometimes that was really an eye opener for people.
And so the Visibility Impact Fund is um, wanting to receive proposals from folks who are trying to address these problems, like these problems that disproportionately affect the bi community. And so what makes for a good proposal given all of that?
Sorry, I kind of got off on a tangent, but let me touch on two other things that we do look for. Um, it doesn't have, so these are all like really big measurable things, but when bi folks are surveyed, one of the biggest things they want is community. They want a place to go to be with people who are similar to them, who understand their experiences. A lot of what we receive grant applications about are people creating those spaces or creating visibility. There's a program called it's hashtag still bisexual, and they have a pretty big social media presence. They also do some in-person work, and they've been a grant recipient of ours. So they're coming in and they're saying we need to continue this visibility, and they were actually looking for support to kind of up their back end of better access to better websites, tools, and that kind of thing. So that was great, like helping with visibility, helping with community. We've had people apply for uh, just general operating funds. So if they are a Bi Plus centered organization, Bi Plus Georgia was one of our recipients. They're a newer 501c3. They're just trying to get started. So we were able to give them a little funding to help them, get some promotional materials together, have some events, that kind of thing. So,
What kind of size are these grants? So, the people who are donating anywhere from $5 a month or on up. But what about the recipients of the grants? What
sure.
kind of
So
range?
our very first grant, so 6 months from when we started, we did our first granting. And just for perspective, we met another organization that they were ecstatic to do their first granting after 3 years of operation. So like 6 months to spin up in 6 months was huge. Our first grants were 500. We did three $500 grants. And we were really aimed at people who were looking for support either for Bi Health Month to do some work there, or like we're getting ready to go do Pride or other kind of tabling or outreach. So, $500 can help you put some brochures together or pay a graphic designer to help you with things, that kind of stuff. We granted a total of $7,500 in September to across three organizations. They were little different sizes. Um, and so our goal as we go forward, we're setting a calendar that in March we do kind of smaller round of granting. Right now we have a call for proposals out for two $2,000 grants and one $1,000 grant. And then in the fall, we want to do larger grants. And so right now, as we're still building our base of donors, we kind of, as we go into a grant cycle, we sort of go, okay, how much can we give? Because one of the things that's really common in funding is that these giant foundations give very little of the money they have, right? They're granting out of endowments mostly, or large pools of invested money that then they take some percentage of it and they donate it every year. We anticipate to be donating the vast majority of what we bring in every year. So eventually, hopefully, we'll be big enough to have staff, and so we'll actually have overhead costs, and that's fine. But we don't want to sit on money. We don't want to invest it somewhere and have it generate income. We want those donations to come in and get back out, because they need to get in the hands of people so they can do stuff with them.
That's so exciting. I mean, I appreciate, all the people who are working on a volunteer capacity and the donors, who are putting not just money, but also time in. I think that's great.
Yeah.
So you see these applications as they come in, and there are probably some things that make very strong applications. You were talking about some of the funded ones. What are the common mistakes that you see grant writers make, either in terms of specifically for this funding, this pot of funding, or if there are just more general things too that you see that it's like, oh, that, that's not necessarily a problem because it's about bisexuality, but this is just problematic in terms of grant proposals?
Sure. So I'd say in general, one of the things we see is if you're not a bi-specific organization, you need to be really specific about what you want to use the money for. Like these are fairly small grants in the scheme of things. And so it should be pretty discreet about what it's doing. And just tell us, like, we need new brochures. Great. we like to know we like to know that. Um, we've had a couple of organizations that were more like peer or community support groups, or providing a couple that were providing um, specifically community support through haircuts and hairstyle work, particularly in some predominantly African American communities in LA, where they're like the ability to do your personal style is really important, and being out there and feeling confident. And right, yes, this is, these things are important. So it's like, it doesn't have to be a giant, we're going to educate the country. It can be like, this is how we're impacting our corner of the world, right? It can be all different types of activities that empower or make the community visible. Oh,
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
yeah. So a few of the mistakes that we've really seen are people telling us that everybody that participates in the program is bi plus, and so it's a bi plus specific programming, except that there's nothing in the name or in the group description that makes it sound like that. Um, and it kind of sounds like, they're doing maybe an important thing, and they just happen to have it be all bi folks. And so now they would like bi plus specific funding. And those are some of the hardest ones to evaluate, because you kind of have to look and go, so did it just happen that this is who the demographic that showed up? Or are you doing something that's specifically feeding a need to the community that we do want to support? And then, because money can be difficult to find, we always get ones that are just not a good fit. Um, and one of the things that we do as part of our educating of organizations and people who are requesting money is I send out individual emails to everybody who puts in a grant application. And there's our process has a number of different layers. And so there's a first layer that just says, are you even, can we even donate to you? So like, there's always some people who send me an application and I'm like, you're not actually 501c3. You might be a community organization that just doesn't have that designation, or I got a couple from for-profit businesses, that were just, I was like, okay, this isn't what we're funding. We can't do this. And for the ones that were just way off base, I just told them that. For a couple of them, I'm like, wow, it looks like you're doing great work. Keep at it. Keep an eye out. We're going to be funding people like you, like down the road. Then everybody who kind of makes that basic, can we even fund you cut, goes to a grant review committee. And we compensate, so far it's been 3-person groups, and they've been pretty good with that. A group of grant reviewers who are all themselves people of color, trans, gender nonconforming, they might, or someone with a disability. It's a granting and philanthropy is hugely cis and white. And even from the bi community, like when we look at our fund, the people who are donating, like it's still heavily slanted towards that demographic. And we feel really passionately that we want to focus our funding on groups that are doing explicit work, anti-racism, fighting anti-Blackness, and that we want to support those communities specifically. So we're like, we need people to be looking at these who are not us, basically. So they go through, and with them, the leadership council decides how many we're going to hand back to our members, right? So we might give them 18 applications and say, give us a slate of 6. That any of these 6, you would be happy if they were funded. And then we take that slate, the say 12 in this case, that didn't get put into the slate. We ask the grant review committee to give us a little feedback, just like a sentence or two. What were you seeing here? And then we pass that along. And
Great.
if it's something that like we think they can address, we give them maybe some concrete like steps, or we give them resources. Hey, it really looks like maybe your leadership team should be working, on becoming more racially inclusive. And here's some resources you can look at. And so we look at their leadership, also who they're serving. Like we want to see those organizations being led by the people they're serving, so that we have that reflected throughout the organization. And then it goes to our members and they do the final voting. And then we let the grant recipients know.
It's a great process. I mean, you've been so thoughtful about, who's going to be involved in that decision making and trying to make sure that you're bringing in folks who might not otherwise have a seat at the table and have some decision making authority. And so that's really fantastic. I am teaching an undergraduate class on bisexuality. And so for their final project, rather than write a research paper, I'm having them do funding proposals because I thought, okay, I know we need more funding for bi-oriented initiatives. And so I thought this would be a really good skill to have. And one of the things that I'm hearing, because I was thinking, all right, well, I want to give them some guidance in terms of what makes a good proposal. And one of the things I'm really hearing from you is it's about specificity. It can be something very small, very granular, that's like here, but here's the thing. And it's not necessarily going to make this much of a difference. But if you can have a little bit of resources that make a little bit of difference, and if a bunch of people are doing that, then together that makes a considerable difference. Is that right?
Yes, very much so. And the group that's working on Visibility Impact Fund, both at the Leadership Council, some of our key volunteers, and then the people who worked on the grant review councils, they all have experience in community organizing, nonprofit work, or volunteerism. That they are well acquainted with where the community is at. And so I think they really recognize that a lot of the organizations that might apply to us, like if we tried to give them $50,000, they wouldn't be able to handle that money. They don't have a structure to plug that into. So, while we're starting granting small, and we would love to be giving bigger grants as we get older and bigger and more established, it's also important to remember like the scale of the organizations themselves. So a bigger organization might have a little project, but a newer organization or a smaller organization that wants to do something that would sort of fundamentally change how they're able to operate, like that would be really special to fund that. You'd be like, yeah, we've had coffee groups for like the last 3 years, and we have this kind of reach. We have people who come regularly, and we would like to have, our first ever all-day event. And here's what it's gonna, here's our goal, and we need to advertise it, or we need to, what are the pieces of it? Another piece that we do ask all of, for our larger grants, we do ask, like, do you have staff? Do you have paid, do you have paid people you work with, or you all volunteer? Because we really recognize the difference in those organizations, and most BI+ work, honestly, is happening with all volunteer work right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, and it's not necessarily about sort of the size of the project, but how meaningful it is to the work that a group is doing.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the things I've seen through the years, Bisexual Organizing Project always has a table at the Twin Cities Pride celebration, which alternates between being the third and fourth largest in the country. I mean, we get between 300,000 and 400,000 people a year to a 2-day event, like vendors, and we take over a park, all this kind of stuff. And one of the most amazing things is people just finding us. Like, it isn't that they're coming up and they have them. They're just like, oh my God, you're here. Like, they see the flags, they see the colors. Bop sells buttons and other fun things, but it's that I found my people in this sea of rainbows and all these other organizations who all are doing awesome work. They're like, oh, but this is mine. Yeah. And so sometimes just creating that visibility, that space, is the most special thing you can do.
And that's huge. And, we know that bisexual people are not necessarily connected to LGBTQ community and are less likely to be connected than lesbian and gay people are. And so having something visible is really important for them to sort of find you, that, yeah, that's great. That's great. So one of the things that the students in my class are doing is giving each other feedback on drafts of the proposals. So it sounds like you do that also. You give feedback so that people can then, maybe be more successful next time. Are there ways of giving feedback on funding proposals that you think are helpful? If there's guidance you're going to give to my students on this, what might you say?
So I come out of a theater tradition. My professional training is out of theatrical design, and we're trained to do critique, right? So a show happens, and you all sit around and you say what worked and what didn't. Um, I always encourage people, if you're evaluating something, like, do identify what's working or what's working mostly and just needs a little more. Like, to tell someone like, oh, this is a great idea, but I want to hear more details, is a lot more helpful than to say, well, this isn't specific enough, because you've given them nowhere to go with that, really. Um, and I think helping people use the process of requesting money to really help shape what they want to do can be very helpful too. So like some of this like writing and feedback process is refining, like, what is this project? How is this money going to be used? Um, so for Visibly Impact Fund, we have we have a questionnaire that you need to answer the questions, but they're very open-ended. So it's like, what's your project? And just tell us about it in like normal words. And that's the other thing I would say is, don't try, you're not writing an academic proposal. You're not writing a proposal to a federal program. Like, just tell a story. There's a need. What need are you trying to meet? How are you going to meet it? If it's not blatantly obvious, why do you think that'll meet it? What outcomes do you want? And particularly, we often are looking at funding things that are starting up. Like, we don't explicitly say, tell us where this goes from here, but that's a way to get a funder excited too, is like, hey, this is the seed money to start a new program. We envision this program growing in the future, if that's what that is. If it's an event, say we want to put on this event. If it goes well, we'd like to make this an annual event. So tell us tell us that you're thinking about where this goes from here.
That's great. And, I'm thinking about, I've applied for and received some federal funding, like from the National Institutes of Health. And I've also been on those review panels. And, from everything from, the $500 grants, I've also, been involved in funding for local community things for social justice work. And on every level, it seems like being specific is so important, because just sort of making general pronouncements about, well, I want to, help people recognize that there are more bisexual people out there than they realize. Like, okay, how are you going to do that? Exactly how are you going to do it? Because for a funder, you need to know that someone's thought through all of that. It's not enough to just go, oh, okay, if we give them the money, they'll figure it out. Like that,
Right.
like the applicant really has to say very precisely, this is what I would do and how I would get there. And this is the difference that it would make, or this is what I think will come out of that. And this is why that's meaningful. What do you think? Does that sound right?
Absolutely. I think one thing to keep in mind as you're thinking about asking for money is that the organization with the money has their own responsibility to make sure that money is used well. So to write something very general, we can look at that and go, well, if you were a personal friend of mine, maybe I know that you come up with great plans, but we don't know you personally. And so we need you to show us what's going on in your mind, in your head, and show us what you want to do with it, so that when we give the money, we feel really comfortable, like, yes, this is going to have a positive impact on the community that we're serving.
Yeah.
So, and I think it's kind of one of those, like when you're doing homework, it's like, show your work. You may know that you're the most awesome person in the world, but you need to show us the specifics of how that's working in this case.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I'm hearing also, like, make sure that you're responding to the questions. Make sure you're responding to the criteria that it's being evaluated on.
Absolutely. Whatever criteria is being provided, like ours is a pretty short paragraph, that probably means you better understand every word in that paragraph. Like there's no extra fluff in our description of what we're looking to fund, and it's very broad, but it also is very specific and says you need to meet this and this. And again, our questions are pretty wide open, but they do ask for some specific things. Especially, we have a question where we say, please tell us how you've invested in anti-racism work. And if you've paid anybody, tell us that you've paid people and how much. Um, and we will get really general answers back. Oh, yeah, we think this is really important. I'm like, oh, well, okay. You don't. You haven't spent money on it. You have not invested time in it. You have not brought in resources to help you learn. It's like you need to, like, if we ask about it, even though that question is not currently a litmus test, it probably will be in the future. If we ask about it, we care. The other question we ask is, are you working in collaboration with anybody? Again, if you're doing it on your own, at this point for us, that's not a make or break. But I have looked at other grants that say, if you're not working in collaboration with other organizations, we will not consider your grant. So like, if they're asking the questions, it's important, even if at this moment it's not going to disqualify you, it's telling you the direction that organization's going.
So as a funder, you're really communicating to the applicants through those criteria and through any statements that you make.
Yeah, I mean, we have 4 core questions, but they're all there for a reason. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, fantastic. So thinking about, okay, my students are learning to do grant writing, and from this, maybe you've already answered this through talking about this work that you're doing as a funder, but what are the ways that they can use those kinds of skills, do you think, after this class is done?
I think this is how you ask for anything. In your future, like if you have a job and you want a particular project, you want to move into a different position, like you need to go in with really like concrete examples of, this is why I should be doing this. I've already thought about this. I have some ideas. And so I think this ability to create a plan, to recognize a need, to create a plan, and to be very specific about it is valuable sort of across the board. I mean, if I want to buy a new couch with my partner, I'm going to be like, hey, our couch seems kind of old and it's not very comfortable. And like, you go all the way back to personal stuff, right? This is, how do you make a specific proposal for something? And how do you see a need and decide how to fill it? Which is really an entrepreneurial thing. Like most entrepreneurs, that's what they've done, is they've seen a need that people want, and they figure out how to meet it. Nonprofit work is just doing that in a social or community context, right? What's a need that I have the capacity to help meet, and then making a plan for it.
And that's great. And I'm hearing I love that example about the couch, because you include in there a rationale. It's like, right, here are all the things that are problems with the couch. And you can even sort of have a vision statement. It's like, oh, if we had a new couch, then I feel like I would, want to cuddle up with you on the couch on a rainy day.
Exactly. I have training in negotiation, and that's all negotiation skills too, right? Is having a basis. But the other thing I would caution people, so when people are sending grant proposals to us, they know that we already understand our community. I have written fairly informal grant proposals for Bisexual Organizing Project and for the Because Conference, and there, my first 3 paragraphs were almost always educating the funder on why it was important. And so that was, you introduce the organization, you introduce the needs, like usually citing specific statistics and references and citations and all that kind of stuff. So you also need to understand where your funder is at. So that would be one thing for your students to decide. Am I requesting funding from an organization that I need to fully justify everything? Or am I requesting funding from an organization that already recognizes needs and I'm telling you how I'm going to meet them?
Oh, and that's such a good point.
Which brings us all the way back around to the funders that we're trying to work with. If a call goes out for how we need to meet mental health needs of the BI+ community, you probably don't need to spend a page talking about the mental health needs of the BI+ community. They obviously already know. You need to talk about specifically how your proposal is going to help meet those.
Hmm.
But if it's a general call, like how can we help fund LGBTQ folks, you need to lay that groundwork so that they understand what you're doing.
That's so helpful. That is so helpful. So, as I know that we could probably talk about this next question for hours, but thinking about what bisexual people need in terms of advocacy, resources, and community. And you obviously have been trained in every field. You've done all these different things, and but you've been a community organizer and engaged in community for such a long time. What do you see? What would you want to receive um, applications for, or what kinds of things would you hope that people are doing?
Well, I'm really looking forward to seeing applications from groups that want to start new programming. Um, and that is really because I want to build the resources that are available to the community. So I love the fact that we get requests to help existing programs expand. Like I mentioned, hashtag still bisexual, they got going on social media. They're kind of building that out. It's great to be able to help them move forward with that. I really am looking forward to proposals from like broader LGBTQ organizations coming and saying, we want to start programming or we want to move from the, yeah, we host a discussion group once a month to something that has funding, that has a presence. Because honestly, our community needs space to be supported and have places that feel safe for us. And we also need visibility. I mean, our name was very carefully thought out. We can't move forward unless we're seen. And we need more things that help people see us. So every one of those listicles that's like top 10 things to never say to a bi woman, like they can get kind of trite. Also, they're just talking about like they're bringing it up. Every kind of trashy article I see about some star that's finally come out as pansexual, I'm like, great, somebody else saw the word, right? Somebody else heard that this is an idea. So we need that visibility. We need people to know that we're everywhere. We're all around them. They just don't know because we don't tell them because it doesn't feel safe. Um, and
Yeah.
so yeah, we need those safe spaces and we need visibility. And then I think everything builds off of that. Um,
Oh, absolutely. That's fantastic. I mean, I think that's such a great vision for what's needed. Is there anything else you would want people to know about bisexuality? I mean, my students already have a good foundation, but is there anything that you're like, there's one thing that everybody could know about bisexuality? This is what I'd want them to know.
I think from the organization, so I used to go out with a presentation on sort of the basics about the Bi Plus community, and I was teaching other organizations. And so we were asking, within your own mission statement, how can you support this community that you just learned about? And I think one of the most telling things was we took all the stereotypes that we all know about bi folks and we tied them specifically to the measurable outcomes that we have. And so we were able to tie, all the stereotypes about being sexually promiscuous or to the fact that we have incredible sexual violence against our community. We're able to tie, I did earlier, we're able to tie this, you're indecisive and you can't make decisions, to outcomes in job situations.
Mhm.
And so I think the most important thing is, whether you're a part of the community or not, is to understand that these stereotypes about us turn into very concrete outcomes. So, for people who might be struggling with their own internalized biphobia, like identify those and root them the hell out of there. Like, understand how you're affected by that. And for other people, realize that 10 years ago, there were surveys done that said most people didn't realize that the stereotypes were stereotypes. They thought they were true. And I'm not sure that that's all gone.
Yeah.
So recognize that these are just as much a stereotype as every racial stereotype we have and class-based stereotype we have. They are just as untrue about individuals. And you can't measure the individual by what you think the group is. So I would really, it's the base of the pyramid. Words hurt and they turn into action. So you just can't let those things slide.
Such an important message. Thank you so much for that. How can people follow or connect with either you or the Visibility Impact Fund, wherever you'd want to direct people?
Sure. Well, we have a website, visibilityimpactfund.org, all spelled out. And on there, we've got some good information like what we do. And there's different sections applying for grants, joining, participating, or just keeping up with us. We have an occasional newsletter that talks about, what we're doing. So you can get that. I promise you, nobody wants our mailing list. We're not selling it. It's just like your name is ours. We're good. Um, and personally, like if some of your students have become fascinated and intrigued, they can reach me at bipanqueerorg at gmail.com. So I've done, like, obviously, I'm one of those people who puts myself out as an educator and to answer questions. And so if you've ever had that question, you're not quite sure who it's safe to ask, you can start with me. I'll tell you if I won't answer.
Wow. Thank you so much, Camille. You are a wealth of information and insight. And I just appreciate the work that you're doing with the Visibility Impact Fund and everything else that you've done that's gotten you here. And I imagine everything else you do in the future, because it doesn't sound like you're about to stop your advocacy for BIPOC plus community. So thank you. And I'm so glad we got a chance to talk.
Thank you so much for asking me. I told you before we started recording, like, you asked me to talk about one of the things I love talking about. So this is wonderful. And I really hope your students found it helpful.
Thank you.